The summer of 1999 arrived with the kind of crystalline promise that makes ordinary families believe in extraordinary adventures. Mark Jensen stood in his suburban garage on a sweltering July morning, methodically checking the straps on their aging blue Subaru Outback for what felt like the 100th time. His weathered hands, calloused from years of weekend carpentry projects, traced each buckle with the careful precision of a man who understood that preparation could mean the difference between triumph and disaster in the wilderness. The morning sun filtered through the dusty garage window, casting long shadows across camping gear that had been accumulating for months in anticipation of this moment. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. Alara Jensen emerged from the kitchen carrying a thermos of coffee that would grow cold before they reached the mountain pass, her auburn hair catching the early light as she surveyed the organized chaos of their departure preparations. She had spent the previous evening double-checking their supplies against a handwritten list that had grown increasingly detailed with each revision, her teacher's instincts demanding thoroughness even in vacation planning. The familiar weight of responsibility sat on her shoulders like an old sweater, comfortable yet confining, as she watched her husband's methodical preparations with a mixture of affection and barely contained excitement. 10-year-old Liam bounced on his toes near the car's rear bumper, his backpack already secured across his narrow shoulders, despite his mother's repeated reminders that they wouldn't be hiking for hours yet. His eyes held the particular brightness of a child on the verge of adventure, darting between his father's equipment checks and the distant horizon where the Rocky Mountains beckoned with their snow-capped promises. The boy had been counting down the days since their trip was first planned, marking each passing date on his bedroom calendar with the kind of religious devotion usually reserved for Christmas morning. His sneakers, still pristine white despite his best efforts to break them in, tapped an anxious rhythm against the concrete floor. 6-year-old Caleb clung to his mother's leg with one hand while clutching a well-worn stuffed bear with the other, his wide eyes taking in the controlled frenzy of departure with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty that only the youngest family members seemed to possess. The bear, named Mr. Patches due to his extensively repaired condition, had been Caleb's constant companion through every childhood milestone, and the boy had insisted with the fierce determination of his age that any adventure worthy of the Jensen family was certainly worthy of his beloved companion. The garage smelled of motor oil, old cardboard boxes, and the lingering scent of the lavender fabric softener Alara used on their sleeping bags. Mark's collection of camping gear told the story of a man who had grown up believing in self-reliance and preparation, each piece carefully selected and maintained despite their family's modest budget. The 2-person tent that would somehow house 4 people had been purchased during their early married years when adventure seemed more important than comfort. The Coleman lantern bore the scratches and dents of previous expeditions to state parks and lakeside campgrounds, each mark a memory of simpler adventures that had prepared them for this ambitious undertaking. Alara ran her fingers along the spine of the trail guide that had started their journey toward the Rocky Mountain wilderness, a book purchased from a dusty shelf at their local outdoor equipment store after considerable deliberation over the cost. The pages were crisp and unmarked, promising trails and vistas that existed in their imagination, with the vivid clarity of dreams not yet tested by reality. She had spent countless evenings studying the topographical maps within its pages, tracing potential routes with her finger, while Mark worked late and the boys slept soundly in their beds. The antique compass that had belonged to Mark's grandfather rested in his palm like a talisman, its brass surface worn smooth by decades of handling. The old man had carried it through the forests of Oregon during hunting trips that had become legendary in family stories, and Mark felt the weight of tradition as much as metal in his hand. The compass needle trembled slightly in the morning light, pointing steadily northward toward mountains that had called to the Jensen family through generations of suburban routine and weekend obligations. Their neighbors had gathered the previous evening for an impromptu farewell barbecue, offering advice and warnings with the casual confidence of people who had never ventured far from marked trails and established campgrounds. Mrs. Henderson from next door had pressed a bag of homemade trail mix into Alara's hands, her voice carrying the particular concern of someone who considered anything beyond city limits to be fraught with unnamed dangers. The well-intentioned warnings had only served to heighten the family's sense that they were embarking on something genuinely significant, a real adventure that would distinguish this summer from all the others that had passed in comfortable predictability. Mark's hiking boots, broken in through months of weekend walks around their neighborhood, felt foreign and substantial on his feet as he made final adjustments to the cargo straps. The leather had developed the kind of suppleness that promised comfort over long distances, though he had yet to test them on anything more challenging than suburban sidewalks and the occasional trail through the local nature preserve. His hands trembled slightly as he tightened the final strap, not from nervousness, but from an excitement he hadn't felt since childhood Christmas mornings. The morning air carried the scent of possibility, that particular combination of warming asphalt and distant pine that speaks to something primal in the human spirit about exploration and discovery. Alara breathed deeply, her chest expanding with anticipation that had been building for months as they planned and prepared for this escape from routine. The weight of her teaching responsibilities, the endless cycle of lesson plans and parent conferences, seemed to lift with each breath of mountain-scented air that drifted down from the peaks visible on the horizon. Liam's excitement was infectious, radiating from his small frame in waves of barely contained energy that made even mundane tasks like loading the cooler seem charged with significance. He had memorized the trail descriptions from their guidebook, reciting elevation gains and scenic overlooks with the precision of a tour guide, though his understanding of what those numbers actually meant in terms of physical challenge remained theoretical. His imagination had transformed their planned expedition into something approaching a heroic quest, complete with wildlife encounters and scenic vistas that would provide stories for years to come. The Subaru's engine turned over with a familiar rumble that had carried the family through years of soccer practices and grocery runs. But this morning the sound seemed to carry additional weight, as if the vehicle itself understood that this journey would be different from their usual suburban travels. Mark adjusted the rearview mirror to better see his sons in the back seat, their faces already turned toward the windows in anticipation of landscapes they had never seen. The morning light streaming through the windshield illuminated the trail guide open on Alara's lap, its pages promising adventures that would test their family bond against the magnificent indifference of wilderness. As they pulled out of their driveway, the familiar neighborhood street stretched behind them like a connection to safety and predictability that would soon be broken. The Jensen family was leaving behind everything comfortable and known, driving toward mountains that existed in their experience only through photographs and stories, carrying dreams that felt as substantial as their carefully packed supplies. The morning held the kind of promise that makes ordinary people believe they are capable of extraordinary things, and the Rocky Mountains waited ahead with the patient inevitability of stone and sky, beautiful and terrible in their ancient silence. The drive to the mountains had taken longer than anticipated, with construction delays and tourist traffic creating bottlenecks that tested even Mark's usually patient demeanor. By the time they reached the popular trailheads, the parking areas were choked with vehicles bearing license plates from across the country, their occupants streaming toward well-marked paths and colorful processions that reminded Alara uncomfortably of school field trips. The carefully planned solitude they had envisioned seemed to evaporate in the face of crowds that treated the wilderness like an outdoor shopping mall, complete with discarded water bottles and the constant chatter of cell phone conversations that seemed to follow civilization into even the most remote corners of nature. Mark sat behind the wheel of their dust-covered Subaru, his knuckles white against the steering wheel as he surveyed the carnival atmosphere of the main trailhead parking lot. Families unpacked elaborate camping setups that would have been more appropriate for a suburban backyard barbecue, while groups of college students treated the mountain approach like a social media photo opportunity, posing against scenic backdrops with the studied casualness of influencers rather than genuine outdoor enthusiasts. The disappointment in his eyes was palpable as he watched his carefully planned wilderness adventure dissolve into something resembling a crowded amusement park. Alara felt her stomach clench with a familiar anxiety as she watched Liam's face fall at the window, his excited anticipation curdling into visible disappointment as he observed the streams of hikers clogging the trail entrances like commuters boarding a subway train. The boy had spent months imagining their family as intrepid explorers, discovering untouched wilderness, and the reality of sharing their adventure with what appeared to be half of Colorado's summer vacation population was crushing his romantic notions with brutal efficiency. His small shoulders sagged against the car seat as he processed this first encounter with the gap between expectation and reality. Caleb, still too young to fully understand the implications of the crowded conditions, pressed his nose against the car window and counted the colorful tents visible through the trees, his innocent excitement providing a stark contrast to his family's growing disillusionment. Mr. Patches sat forgotten in his lap as the boy marveled at what appeared to him like a wonderful outdoor party, his 6-year-old perspective unable to grasp why the presence of so many other families might diminish rather than enhance their adventure. His wide eyes reflected pure wonder at the spectacle, making his family's disappointment seem almost petty by comparison. The trail guide lay open across Alara's knees, its pristine pages now seeming almost mocking in their promises of secluded alpine meadows and crystal-clear mountain streams. She flipped through the sections they had studied so carefully, her teacher's eye now noticing details that had escaped her attention during their suburban planning sessions. Tucked between the main trail descriptions, almost as an afterthought, was a brief mention of alternative routes that promised more challenging terrain in exchange for greater solitude. Her finger traced along the small print that described these secondary paths with the kind of casual brevity that suggested they were intended for experienced hikers rather than suburban families on their first major wilderness expedition. Mark's grandfather's compass felt heavier in his pocket as he made the decision that would alter their family's destiny, its antique weight seeming to pull him toward choices that honored tradition over caution. The old man had often spoken of finding his own path through unmarked wilderness, navigating by instinct and experience rather than following the well-worn routes that others had established. The memory of those stories, enhanced by years of retelling and the romantic distance of time, whispered seductively in Mark's ear as he contemplated alternatives to the crowded main trails. The parking area for the alternative route lay 15 miles further up a winding mountain road that seemed to climb directly into the clouds, its asphalt surface gradually giving way to packed dirt and loose gravel that made their suburban vehicle feel inadequate and exposed. The transition from paved certainty to wilderness uncertainty was gradual, but unmistakable, marked by the disappearance of cell phone towers and the increasing gaps between passing vehicles until they drove in complete isolation through forests that seemed to close behind them like a living curtain. When they finally reached the remote parking area, the contrast with the crowded main trailhead was immediately apparent and intoxicating. Only 2 other vehicles occupied the small clearing carved from the surrounding pine forest, their dust-covered exteriors and serious-looking equipment suggesting owners who belonged in this environment in ways the Jensen family could only aspire to achieve. The silence was profound and immediate, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a bird that Liam couldn't identify despite his recent intensive study of regional wildlife guides. Alara stepped from the car onto ground that felt different beneath her feet, less stable somehow than the carefully maintained paths they had originally planned to follow. The earth here was covered with a thick carpet of pine needles and decomposing leaves that compressed under her weight with a soft sighing sound that seemed to absorb and muffle even the smallest noises. The air itself felt thinner and wilder, carrying scents of resin and wildflowers mixed with something indefinably ancient that spoke to parts of her consciousness that rarely stirred in suburban environments. The trail marker that indicated their chosen route was smaller and less elaborate than those at the main trailhead, carved from weathered wood that had been darkened by years of mountain weather until the letters were barely visible against the grain. Mark ran his fingers along the rough surface, feeling the texture of wood that had been shaped by wind and rain and snow until it seemed more like a natural formation than human construction. The marker pointed toward a path that disappeared into shadows beneath towering evergreens, its destination invisible from their starting point, but promised by the cryptic notations in their increasingly precious guidebook. Liam shouldered his backpack with renewed enthusiasm, his disappointment at the crowded main trails completely forgotten in the face of this new adventure that seemed to promise everything his imagination had conjured during months of anticipation. The boy's energy was infectious, radiating outward from his small frame and lifting the spirits of his entire family as they prepared to step away from their vehicle and into wilderness that suddenly felt genuine and untamed. His hiking boots, still stiff from the store despite his mother's attempts to break them in, left clear impressions in the soft earth as he bounded toward the trail entrance with the fearless confidence of youth. The decision to follow the alternative route felt natural and inevitable in that moment, supported by the profound quiet of their surroundings and the promise of solitude that had drawn them to the mountains in the first place. Mark locked their Subaru with a decisive click that seemed unnaturally loud in the forest silence, the sound echoing briefly among the trees before being absorbed by the vast indifference of wilderness. Their vehicle sat alone in the small clearing, looking somehow fragile and temporary against the backdrop of ancient pines that had weathered countless seasons without regard for human presence or absence. Alara took one final look at the trail guide, studying the hand-drawn map that showed their chosen route as a dotted line winding through terrain marked with elevation contours and cryptic symbols that she hoped she understood correctly. The guidebook felt substantial in her hands, its pages filled with information that represented months of research and planning, yet suddenly seemed inadequate preparation for the reality of unmarked wilderness stretching away from them in all directions. The weight of responsibility for her family's safety pressed against her chest like a physical burden, as she realized how completely they were about to commit themselves to paths that existed only as lines on paper and promises in outdated text. The forest around them seemed to pulse with hidden life and ancient secrets, its shadows holding depths that no amount of suburban preparation could fully illuminate or explain. As the Jensen family took their first steps onto the narrow trail that would lead them away from safety and into legend, the mountains received them with the same patient silence that had welcomed countless others who had sought adventure in their stone embrace, indifferent to human intentions and blind to the tragic poetry that was about to unfold among their timeless peaks. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet of nature undisturbed, but something far more ominous, the profound absence of human voices that should have returned with the evening light. When Tuesday's sunset painted the remote parking area in shades of amber and gold, the Jensen family's dusty blue Subaru sat alone among the pine trees, its windows reflecting the dying light like vacant eyes staring into an emptiness that was beginning to feel permanent. The vehicle's solitary presence spoke of promises unkept and schedules abandoned, its very stillness a contradiction to the energy and anticipation that had filled it just hours before. Wednesday morning brought the first ripples of concern that would eventually become waves of desperate searching. Mark's brother Tom had expected a call the previous evening, a traditional check-in that Mark never missed when the family traveled beyond their suburban boundaries. The phone in Tom's kitchen had remained stubbornly silent through dinner and beyond, its absence of ringing becoming increasingly significant as the hours accumulated into genuine worry. Tom's wife Sarah paced their living room with the restless energy of someone whose intuition was screaming warnings that her rational mind wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. By Wednesday afternoon, when still no word had come from the mountains, Tom's concern had crystallized into action. His hands shook slightly as he dialed the number for the county sheriff's office, his voice steady despite the growing pit of anxiety in his stomach as he explained that his brother's family had missed their expected return from a hiking trip in the Rocky Mountain wilderness. The dispatcher's professional calm provided little comfort as she took down the details with practiced efficiency, her questions revealing the systematic approach that would soon mobilize resources across multiple agencies. The search operation began at dawn on Thursday, with the methodical precision of a military campaign, though beneath the professional competence ran an undercurrent of urgency that spoke to every searcher's understanding of how quickly the mountains could claim the unprepared. Sheriff Margaret Chen stood in the remote parking area where the Jensen family's vehicle had been discovered, her experienced eyes taking in details that would later assume crucial importance in the investigation that followed. The Subaru sat exactly as the family had left it, its doors locked and contents undisturbed, presenting a puzzle that would haunt the search teams for months to come. The first helicopter lifted off from the valley floor as the morning mist still clung to the pine trees, its rotors beating a rhythmic pattern that would become the soundtrack to one of the most extensive search operations in the region's history. Pilot Jack Morrison had participated in dozens of mountain rescues over his 20-year career, but something about the Jensen case felt different from the beginning, though he couldn't articulate exactly what made this particular search feel so heavy with foreboding. The aircraft's shadow passed over terrain that looked deceptively benign from above, its rocky outcroppings and dense forest canopy hiding secrets that would resist revelation despite the most sophisticated technology available. Ground teams formed at the trailhead with the grim efficiency of professionals who understood that time was their enemy in ways that transcended mere inconvenience. Team leader Rodriguez distributed topographical maps with practiced movements, his calloused fingers tracing potential routes while his mind calculated distances and elevation changes that could make the difference between life and death for a family caught unprepared by mountain weather. Each searcher carried equipment that represented years of refinement in search and rescue methodology, yet all their technology felt inadequate against the vast indifference of wilderness that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. The trail that the Jensen family had followed began innocuously enough, winding through stands of aspen and pine that showed no signs of recent passage, despite careful examination by trackers whose skills had been honed through decades of reading stories written in disturbed earth and broken vegetation. The path itself seemed to mock their efforts, its packed dirt surface holding footprints for mere hours before mountain winds and the constant traffic of small animals erased all evidence of human passage. Search dog teams worked the area with the methodical thoroughness of their training, but even the most experienced animals seemed confused by scent trails that appeared and vanished without logical explanation. As the search expanded into its second day, the operation took on the character of a small city transplanted to the wilderness, complete with command posts, communication networks, and supply lines that stretched back to civilization like umbilical cords connecting hope to reality. Volunteer searchers arrived in increasing numbers, many of them parents themselves who found in the Jensen family's plight a reflection of their own worst fears about the vulnerability of those they loved most. The parking area became a staging ground for organized desperation. Its peaceful isolation transformed into a hub of activity that felt both necessary and somehow futile against the overwhelming scope of the surrounding mountains. The discovery of the family's abandoned vehicle had yielded few clues despite forensic examination that revealed every detail of their final moments in civilization. The car keys rested in Mark Jensen's hiking boot, exactly where he had placed them with the confidence of someone who expected to return before darkness fell. Alara's purse sat undisturbed in the front seat, her wallet containing family photographs that smiled up at investigators with the innocent joy of people who believed their story would have a happy ending. The boy's extra clothing lay neatly folded in the back seat, testament to a mother's careful preparation for contingencies that had proven inadequate against the reality they had encountered. Search teams worked in expanding grids that covered hundreds of square miles of terrain so rugged that even experienced mountaineers approached it with respect, bordering on fear. The area beyond the established trail network was a maze of box canyons and unstable slopes where a wrong step could send hikers tumbling into crevices that might remain hidden for decades. Helicopter crews reported numerous false sightings that sent ground teams racing toward colorful objects that proved to be wildflowers or pieces of abandoned camping equipment left by previous visitors who had been more fortunate in their timing or judgment. The psychological toll of the fruitless search began to show in the searchers' faces as days accumulated without meaningful progress toward any resolution. Sheriff Chen found herself balancing the demands of a resource-intensive operation against the statistical reality that survival rates dropped precipitously with each passing day in mountain wilderness. The media attention that had initially seemed helpful in recruiting volunteers was becoming a complication, as reporters asked increasingly pointed questions about the effectiveness of search strategies that had yielded no tangible results, despite enormous expenditures of time and personnel. Technical rescue specialists rappelled into gorges and explored cave systems with the thoroughness of archaeologists excavating an ancient civilization. But the mountains kept their secrets with the patient stubbornness of geological time. Each potential lead dissolved under investigation, leaving behind only the growing certainty that the Jensen family had encountered something beyond the scope of normal search and rescue operations. The wilderness seemed to swallow their voices and footprints with the same casual efficiency it had demonstrated for millennia, reducing human drama to insignificance against the backdrop of stone and sky and endless forest. As the organized search entered its second week, the operation began to take on the characteristics of a vigil rather than a rescue mission, though no one was willing to articulate that transformation openly. Equipment caches that had been established with the optimism of imminent discovery became semi-permanent installations that served more as symbols of persistence than practical staging areas for active searching. The Jensen family's photographs, distributed widely among search teams and media outlets, became icons of every parent's nightmare about the fragility of family bonds against forces beyond human control or understanding. The silence of the mountains grew more oppressive with each passing day, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath in anticipation of revelations that might never come. Search helicopters continued their systematic sweeps of terrain that looked identical from altitude, their crews scanning endless acres of forest and stone for any sign of four people who had simply vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. The remote parking area where their vehicle waited became a pilgrimage site for family members and volunteers, who found in its emptiness a physical manifestation of questions that had no answers and hopes that were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The transformation of the Jensen disappearance from a tragic but comprehensible accident into something far more sinister began in the cluttered newsroom of the Red Creek Herald, where editor Patricia Morse stared at computer screens filled with search updates that contained nothing but negative results. Her weathered fingers drummed against the laminated desktop as she processed the uncomfortable reality that 3 weeks of intensive searching had produced exactly zero evidence of what had befallen the missing family. The newspaper's modest circulation had quintupled since the story broke, with readers from across the state calling for updates on a mystery that seemed to grow more impenetrable with each passing day. Patricia's investigation into similar disappearances revealed a pattern that chilled her seasoned journalist instincts, despite decades of covering crime stories that had seemingly exhausted her capacity for surprise. The computer database searches she conducted in her cramped office showed 7 other families who had vanished in the broader Rocky Mountain region over the past 15 years, each leaving behind vehicles in remote parking areas and absolutely no trace of their subsequent whereabouts. The files spread across her desk told stories that shared disturbing similarities. Experienced hikers who had disappeared on clear days from well-marked trails, leaving behind equipment and supplies that suggested they had been prepared for their adventures. The Red Creek Police Department found itself overwhelmed by media attention that transformed their modest headquarters into something resembling a war room, complete with banks of phones that rang constantly with tips from psychics, conspiracy theorists, and well-meaning citizens whose observations had been filtered through layers of speculation and fear. Detective Maria Santos, who had initially approached the Jensen case as a straightforward search and rescue operation, now found herself fielding calls from reporters whose questions revealed assumptions about serial killers and organized crime that made her deeply uncomfortable. The missing family's photographs, blown up to poster size and mounted on the station's bulletin boards, seemed to watch her with accusing eyes as she struggled to maintain professional skepticism against mounting pressure to provide explanations she simply didn't possess. The first mention of a possible serial killer operating in the Rocky Mountain wilderness appeared in a Denver television news broadcast that treated speculation as established fact, complete with dramatic music and computer-generated graphics that transformed the Jensen family's tragedy into entertainment for viewers whose lives were safely removed from the reality of grief and unanswered questions. The segment featured interviews with self-appointed experts who spoke with confident authority about predatory behavior patterns while displaying maps marked with red pins that created visual connections between disappearances that might have been entirely coincidental. The broadcast's impact was immediate and lasting, creating a narrative framework that would prove impossible to dislodge, despite a complete absence of supporting evidence. Within days of the television broadcast, the Jensen case had metastasized from a local tragedy into a regional obsession that drew amateur investigators, paranormal enthusiasts, and true crime podcasters to Red Creek like pilgrims to a shrine. The small town's single motel filled with visitors who treated the family's disappearance as a puzzle to be solved through sheer determination and internet research, their presence transforming the community's grieving process into a spectacle that made normal life increasingly difficult for longtime residents. The diner on Main Street became an unofficial headquarters for conspiracy theorists who covered its tables with printouts and photographs while debating theories that grew more elaborate and disconnected from reality with each retelling. The mythology surrounding the Jensen disappearance evolved with the viral logic of urban legends, incorporating elements that had nothing to do with the actual facts, but satisfied psychological needs for explanation and narrative coherence that the truth had failed to provide. Stories circulated about mysterious figures seen in the mountains, strange lights in the sky, and government cover-ups involving everything from military experiments to alien abductions. Each retelling added new details that were accepted as fact by subsequent storytellers, creating a feedback loop that transformed 4 missing people into characters in a horror story that bore increasingly little resemblance to the suburban family, who had simply wanted to spend a weekend hiking in the wilderness. The police department's evidence room contained boxes of materials that reflected the public's desperate need to believe that the Jensen family's fate could be explained through conventional criminal logic. Anonymous tips poured in by the hundreds, describing suspicious individuals whose only crime seemed to be appearing unusual to nervous observers, who had been primed by media coverage to see danger in every unfamiliar face. Detective Santos spent countless hours investigating leads that invariably dissolved under scrutiny, leaving behind only the growing certainty that the public's hunger for resolution had created its own reality that existed independently of facts or evidence. The online communities that formed around the Jensen case demonstrated the internet's capacity to transform tragedy into entertainment. with forums dedicated to analyzing every detail of the family's disappearance through the lens of amateur criminology and pop psychology. Members of these digital tribes treated the missing family like characters in a murder mystery novel, assigning motives and meanings to perfectly innocent details, while ignoring the simple possibility that sometimes people disappeared in the wilderness for reasons that had nothing to do with human malevolence. The family's social media profiles became archaeological sites where strangers excavated private moments and family photographs for clues that existed only in their own imaginations. The campfire stories that began circulating throughout the region transformed the Jensen family into cautionary tales that parents used to frighten children into compliance with hiking safety rules. Around recreational vehicle parks and established campgrounds, the family's disappearance became a ghost story that grew more elaborate and terrifying with each retelling, incorporating elements of local folklore and regional superstitions that had nothing to do with suburban parents and their children. The stories served a psychological function that transcended their relationship to reality, providing listeners with the illusion that they could protect themselves from similar fates by avoiding specific behaviors or locations that featured in the evolving mythology. Television producers descended on Red Creek with crews and equipment that transformed the town's quiet streets into temporary movie sets, their presence generating economic activity that created uncomfortable ethical tensions for residents who needed the tourist dollars but resented the exploitation of their community's tragedy. The resulting documentaries and news specials treated the Jensen disappearance as content to be packaged and consumed, complete with dramatic reenactments, featuring actors who bore little resemblance to the missing family, but satisfied viewers' need for visual representation of events that had left no witnesses or evidence. The psychological impact of the media attention on the Jensen family's surviving relatives was devastating in ways that the public never fully grasped, turning their private grief into public property that could be analyzed and debated by strangers who felt entitled to opinions about people they had never met. Tom Jensen found his own social media accounts flooded with messages from true crime enthusiasts who treated his brother's disappearance like a hobby, offering theories and asking for details that turned his family's tragedy into entertainment for people whose lives had been untouched by genuine loss. The constant speculation and conspiracy theories made the normal grieving process impossible, trapping the surviving family members in a permanent state of suspended animation between hope and despair. The FBI's decision to open a formal investigation into the possibility of serial killer activity in the Rocky Mountain region lent official credibility to theories that had previously existed only in the realm of speculation and media sensationalism. The federal agents who arrived in Red Creek brought resources and expertise that the local police department lacked, but they also brought assumptions about criminal behavior that shaped their investigation in ways that might have led them away from simpler explanations for the Jensen family's fate. The presence of federal investigators transformed the case from a missing persons investigation into something that resembled a manhunt for a predator who might have existed only in the collective imagination of a community traumatized by inexplicable loss. The legend of the Rocky Mountain family killer grew beyond the bounds of the Jensen case, incorporating disappearances and unsolved crimes from across the western United States into a narrative framework that satisfied the public's need for patterns and explanations even when none actually existed. The mythical serial killer became a convenient explanation for any unexplained disappearance in wilderness areas, relieving communities of the need to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that nature itself was often predator enough to claim lives without requiring human malevolence to explain the tragedy. The Jensen family's disappearance had become the cornerstone of a mythology that served everyone's psychological needs, except those of the people who had actually known and loved the missing family members. 13 years later, in a cramped apartment above a geology supply store in Boulder, Colorado, Owen Hayes sat surrounded by the accumulated detritus of an obsession that had consumed more than a decade of his life. The walls of his makeshift office were covered with topographical maps, weather charts, and geological surveys that created a paper tapestry of scientific precision, overlaid with the desperate hope that empirical analysis could succeed where intuition and speculation had failed. His desk, a salvaged laboratory table from the university where he had once studied before academic pressures and personal demons had derailed his formal education, groaned under the weight of 3-ring binders containing every scrap of information he had collected about the Jensen family disappearance. Owen's hands, stained permanently with the mineral dust of countless field samples, traced elevation contours on a USGS topographical map with the reverent precision of a monk illuminating a sacred text. his fingertips had memorized every ridge and valley in the search area, every seasonal streambed and geological formation that might have played a role in the family's fate. The magnifying glass he used to examine the finest details had belonged to his grandfather, a mining engineer whose methodical approach to problem-solving had been Owen's first exposure to the patient persistence required to extract truth from unwilling landscapes. The photograph of the Jensen family that served as the focal point of his investigation had been enlarged and enhanced through digital processes until individual pixels were visible, transforming Mark Jensen's confident smile and Alara's protective embrace of her sons into abstract mosaics of light and shadow. Owen had studied these images with the intensity of an art historian analyzing a masterpiece, searching for environmental clues that might reveal details about their intended destination or the conditions they had encountered. The camera's metadata had provided timestamps and GPS coordinates that contradicted some of the official timeline assumptions, discrepancies that Owen had highlighted with different colored markers, until his copy of the photograph resembled a complex mathematical proof. His coffee maker, a battered camping percolator that had seen more use in his apartment than it ever had in wilderness settings, produced the bitter fuel that powered his nocturnal research sessions, when the outside world grew quiet enough for him to hear the whispers of intuition that daylight and normal human activity seemed to drown out. The ritual of grinding beans and measuring water had become a meditative practice that helped organize his thoughts and prepare his mind for the kind of analytical thinking that his obsession demanded. The aroma of brewing coffee mixed with the musty scent of old books and the metallic tang of mineral samples created an olfactory signature that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. The collection of vintage trail guides that lined his bookshelves represented years of hunting through used bookstores, estate sales, and online auctions for publications that might have been available to the Jensen family during their fatal planning phase. Owen had discovered that trail guides were often reprinted without adequate updating, creating dangerous lag times between changing conditions on the ground and the information available to hikers who trusted published sources for their safety. His copy of the 1997 edition of Colorado Mountain Trails bore the same publication information that had appeared on the Jensen family's recovered guidebook, its pages marked with sticky notes and margin annotations that traced his growing understanding of how outdated information could lead well-intentioned families into deadly situations. The Geological Survey reports that occupied an entire filing cabinet in his apartment contained technical data about slope stability, seasonal water flow patterns, and soil composition that revealed the dynamic nature of mountain environments in ways that popular hiking guides never acknowledged. Owen's background in geology had taught him to read landscapes as historical documents, understanding that what appeared stable and permanent to casual observers was actually in constant flux, subject to erosion, seasonal flooding, and the kind of catastrophic changes that could transform familiar terrain into death traps overnight. His analysis of the search area had identified several locations where geological instability could have created hazardous conditions that might not have been obvious to recreational hikers. The weather data from the summer of 1999 occupied several binders filled with charts and graphs that Owen had compiled from National Weather Service archives, revealing patterns of afternoon thunderstorms and rapid temperature changes that could have caught the Jensen family unprepared despite their careful planning. His correlation of weather patterns with search and rescue statistics had shown clear relationships between seemingly minor environmental changes and dramatic increases in hiking accidents, patterns that suggested the family might have encountered conditions that overwhelmed their suburban experience and equipment. The barometric pressure readings from the day of their disappearance showed the kind of instability that mountain weather was famous for, with systems moving through the area that could have created dangerous conditions with little warning. Owen's computer, an aging desktop machine whose hard drives contained terabytes of data related to the Jensen case, hummed constantly in the corner of his apartment like a mechanical heartbeat that measured the passage of time in search queries and database analyses. The digital files he had accumulated included satellite imagery, geological surveys, and historical accident reports that painted a picture of the search area as far more dangerous than the official investigation had acknowledged. His custom mapping software overlaid multiple data sources to create three-dimensional models of the terrain that revealed potential hazards invisible to traditional search methods, showing how the landscape itself might have conspired against the family's safe return. The personal toll of his obsession was visible in every aspect of Owen's life, From the takeout containers that served as his primary source of nutrition, to the social isolation that had gradually separated him from friends and romantic relationships that couldn't compete with his singular focus on solving a mystery that had defeated professional investigators. His answering machine contained dozens of unanswered messages from concerned family members, whose voices had grown increasingly distant and frustrated, as his normal life had been consumed by his amateur investigation. The mirror in his bathroom reflected a man whose appearance had been shaped by years of poor sleep and inadequate self-care, his face bearing the hollow-cheeked intensity of someone whose identity had become completely merged with an intellectual challenge that might prove unsolvable. The breakthrough that would eventually vindicate Owen's years of solitary research began with a seemingly insignificant discrepancy in the official search records, a notation about trail conditions that contradicted his understanding of the area's geological history. His analysis of historical aerial photographs had revealed that a secondary trail system, abandoned decades earlier due to safety concerns, had been misrepresented in the guidebook that the Jensen family had used for their planning. The trail descriptions in their 1997 guide referenced routes that had been closed to public use since the 1980s, creating a dangerous disconnect between published information and actual ground conditions that could have led the family into areas where rescue would be virtually impossible. Owen's field equipment, assembled over years of careful saving and strategic purchases, filled military surplus containers that transformed his apartment into something resembling an expedition staging area. The specialized geological instruments he had acquired included ground-penetrating radar units, core sampling equipment, and GPS devices calibrated to survey-grade accuracy that would allow him to locate and examine areas that had been inaccessible to the original search teams. His hiking gear reflected the kind of serious preparation that the Jensen family had lacked, with clothing and equipment designed for extended exposure to mountain conditions that could shift from benign to deadly without warning. The maps that covered his walls told a story of systematic analysis that had gradually narrowed the search area from hundreds of square miles to a handful of specific locations where geological conditions and trail access patterns aligned with his theories about the family's fate. Owen's methodology combined traditional geological fieldwork with modern forensic analysis techniques, creating an investigative approach that bridged the gap between scientific rigor and intuitive reasoning. His color-coded marking system revealed patterns in the data that had been invisible to investigators, who lacked his specialized knowledge of how geological processes could create hidden dangers in apparently safe hiking areas. The decision to undertake a personal search mission had crystallized slowly over months of preparation, driven by Owen's growing certainty that he had identified the actual location where the Jensen family had encountered their fate. His analysis suggested that they had been victims of a geological event rather than human predation, trapped by circumstances that had left no obvious traces for conventional search methods to discover. The weight of 13 years of speculation and mythology pressed against his shoulders as he prepared to venture into terrain that had claimed 4 lives and defeated dozens of professional searchers, carrying nothing but scientific instruments, and the desperate hope that empirical analysis could finally provide answers to questions that had haunted an entire region for more than a decade. The morning Owen Hayes began his solitary expedition into the forbidden territory of Deadfall Canyon dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that mountain weather reserves for its most deceptive moods, when azure skies and gentle breezes mask the lethal potential that lurks in seemingly benign landscapes. His rented 4-wheel-drive vehicle climbed the deteriorating access road with mechanical determination, its engine laboring against grades that had been carved into mountainsides decades earlier by logging operations that had long since abandoned this remote corner of wilderness to the patient reclamation efforts of wind and weather. The GPS unit mounted on his dashboard showed coordinates that corresponded to no official trail system, directing him toward terrain that existed in bureaucratic limbo between national forest boundaries and private land holdings that had been forgotten by their original owners. Owen's backpack, loaded with 48 pounds of scientific equipment and survival gear, pressed against his shoulders with the familiar weight of preparation that had consumed weeks of careful planning and equipment testing in his Boulder apartment. The ground-penetrating radar unit, compact enough to be portable but sophisticated enough to detect subsurface anomalies, represented the technological edge that he hoped would succeed where conventional search methods had failed. His geological survey tools, including core sampling equipment and mineral identification kits, transformed him from amateur investigator into a one-man scientific expedition whose methodology bridged the gap between academic rigor and desperate hope. The trailhead that marked the beginning of Owen's descent into Deadfall Canyon existed only as a barely visible depression in the undergrowth, its original markers having been removed years earlier when the route was officially closed, due to geological instability that made rescue operations virtually impossible. The canyon's name, according to historical surveys that Owen had unearthed in government archives, derived from a series of catastrophic rock slides in the 1970s that had killed 2 experienced climbers and led to the area being declared off-limits to recreational use. The irony that the Jensen family might have been led to this deadly location by outdated guidebook information was not lost on Owen as he checked his equipment one final time, before beginning his descent into terrain that had been forbidden for good reason. The silence that enveloped Owen as he began his solitary journey into the canyon was profound and somehow accusatory, as if the landscape itself resented his intrusion into secrets that had been guarded for 13 years. His footsteps on the treacherous scree slope sounded unnaturally loud in the thin mountain air, each displaced stone clattering down the mountainside with echoes that seemed to announce his presence to whatever spirits might inhabit this deadly place. The specialized climbing gear that secured his descent felt inadequate against the magnitude of the geological forces that had shaped this terrain, forces that could be reactivated without warning by the very vibrations his movement created. The first indication that Owen's theory might be correct appeared 3 hours into his descent, when his metal detector began registering subsurface anomalies that corresponded to the metallic components of modern hiking equipment. The readings were faint and intermittent, requiring him to move in careful grid patterns while documenting each signal with GPS coordinates that would allow him to return to promising locations even if his initial investigation proved inconclusive. His hands shook slightly as he recorded the readings in his field notebook, the possibility that he was finally closing in on answers creating an adrenaline response that made precise scientific documentation more challenging than his apartment-based practice sessions had suggested. The geological composition of the canyon floor revealed layers of deposited material that told a story of repeated catastrophic events, with debris fields containing fragments of rock that had traveled miles from their original formations during massive slide events that reshaped the landscape with each occurrence. Owen's trained eye identified stratification patterns that indicated multiple slide events over decades, creating an unstable substrate where human remains and equipment could be buried beneath tons of accumulated stone and sediment. The realization that conventional search dogs would have been unable to detect scent trails through such geological barriers explained why the original search efforts had found no trace of the Jensen family despite their thoroughness and dedication. The discovery that would vindicate 13 years of obsessive research began as a metallic glint barely visible beneath a thin layer of weathered granite chips, requiring Owen to clear debris with the careful precision of an archaeologist excavating an ancient burial site. His entrenching tool, designed for military field use, revealed corners of what appeared to be a metal camping pot, its aluminum surface darkened by years of exposure, but still recognizable as the type of equipment that recreational hikers would have carried. The emotional impact of finding physical evidence hit Owen with unexpected force, his scientific objectivity overwhelmed by the realization that he was potentially uncovering the final resting place of 4 people, whose disappearance had haunted him for more than a decade. The methodical excavation process that followed required Owen to document every detail with photographic evidence and precise measurements, transforming the discovery site into an outdoor laboratory where scientific rigor battled against his desperate need for immediate answers. Each layer of debris that he carefully removed revealed additional artifacts: a child's hiking boot, still small enough to evoke the innocent excitement that 10-year-old Liam must have felt when he first laced it up in his family's suburban garage, and fragments of technical clothing that had been designed to protect against mountain weather, but had proven inadequate against the geological violence that had claimed the Jensen family. The moment when Owen's excavation revealed the corner of what appeared to be a leather-bound journal sent shockwaves through his nervous system that made his hands tremble so violently that he was forced to stop digging and steady himself against a boulder while processing the magnitude of what he had discovered. The book, partially protected by its position beneath larger debris, bore water damage and weathering that testified to 13 years of exposure to mountain conditions. But its basic structure remained intact enough to suggest that its contents might still be legible. The realization that he might be about to read the final thoughts of Alara Jensen, documented during the family's last desperate days, created an emotional response that no amount of scientific training had prepared him to handle. Owen's field preservation techniques, learned through years of geological specimen collection, proved crucial as he carefully extracted the journal from its resting place and sealed it in a protective container designed to prevent further deterioration during his trek back to civilization. The weight of the book in his hands felt disproportionate to its physical mass, as if 13 years of unanswered questions and accumulated grief had somehow been compressed into its damaged pages. His scientific equipment registered environmental conditions that would allow for proper preservation during transport, but the emotional significance of his discovery made technical details seem almost irrelevant compared to the human story that the journal might contain. The additional artifacts that Owen uncovered during his systematic search of the debris field painted a picture of the Jensen family's final days that was both heartbreaking and illuminating, revealing how quickly their planned adventure had transformed into a desperate struggle for survival against forces beyond their suburban experience. Children's toys and family photographs, preserved in sealed plastic bags that demonstrated Ilara's careful preparation for their trip, created tangible connections to lives that had been reduced to statistics and speculation for more than a decade. The camping equipment that Owen excavated showed signs of hasty packing and desperate attempts at emergency shelter construction, suggesting that the family had realized their danger and attempted to survive rather than simply vanishing without trace. The geological evidence surrounding the artifact site confirmed Owen's theoretical framework about the family's fate, with debris patterns indicating that they had been caught in a massive rockslide event that buried them beneath tons of stone with such speed that escape would have been impossible. The stratification layers above the artifact site showed that multiple slide events had occurred since 1999, creating geological burial conditions that explained why conventional search methods had failed to locate any trace of the missing family. Owen's analysis of the site's position relative to the outdated trail descriptions in the Jensen family's guidebook showed how easily recreational hikers could have been led into this deadly terrain by information that failed to acknowledge the geological hazards that made the area unsuitable for human travel. The emotional toll of his discovery began to manifest as Owen prepared for his dangerous ascent back to civilization. The weight of 13 years' worth of questions finally answered pressing against his consciousness, with the same relentless force that had driven his obsessive investigation. The journal in his pack represented more than evidence of what had befallen the Jensen family. It was a testament to human endurance in the face of impossible circumstances, a document that would transform 4 missing people back into a real family, whose final days had been filled with love and desperation, rather than the mythological violence that had dominated public speculation. The responsibility of carrying their story back to the world that had spent more than a decade creating elaborate explanations for their disappearance felt heavier than all his scientific equipment combined, a burden that would stay with him long after the physical challenges of his expedition had been overcome. The laboratory at the University of Colorado where Owen brought Ilara Jensen's recovered journal felt sterile and clinical, compared to the raw emotional power of the mountain canyon where it had rested for 13 years. Its fluorescent lights and temperature-controlled environment creating an antiseptic backdrop for revelations that would shatter more than a decade of speculation and mythology. The document preservation specialists who worked alongside Owen treated the water-damaged pages with the reverent care usually reserved for ancient manuscripts, their latex-gloved hands turning each fragile leaf with movements so gentle they seemed to be handling religious relics rather than the final testament of a suburban mother's desperate love for her family. The first legible entry, dated July 15, 1999, revealed handwriting that remained remarkably steady despite the circumstances that must have prompted Ilara to begin documenting their experience. Her teacher's training evident in the careful formation of letters that had been designed for maximum legibility, even under stress. The opening lines spoke of excitement and anticipation that seemed to mock the tragic outcome that Owen already knew awaited the family. Describing their successful navigation of the initial trail sections and their growing confidence in their ability to handle wilderness challenges that had initially seemed daunting from the safety of their suburban planning sessions. As Owen worked through the sequential pages with microscopic care, the progression of entries revealed how quickly the family's adventure had transformed from pleasant hiking excursion into life-threatening emergency, the handwriting growing increasingly hurried and desperate, as Ilara documented conditions that were deteriorating faster than their limited experience had prepared them to handle. The journal entries provided minute-by-minute documentation of decision-making processes that had seemed reasonable at the time, but had ultimately led the family deeper into geological terrain, where rescue would prove impossible, even if they had possessed means of communication with the outside world. The third day's entries revealed the critical moment when Mark Jensen had made the navigational error that sealed their fate, following trail markers that belonged to the abandoned route system, rather than the safe paths described in their guidebook. his confidence in his grandfather's compass, leading them into terrain where the antique instrument's accuracy became irrelevant compared to the geological hazards that surrounded them. Alara's description of their growing realization that they were lost captured the subtle shift from inconvenience to genuine fear that must have occurred when familiar landmarks failed to appear, and their carefully planned timeline began to dissolve into something approaching panic. The meteorological catastrophe that transformed their manageable crisis into deadly emergency was documented in Alara's increasingly frantic handwriting as she described the sudden thunderstorm that struck their exposed position with violence that their suburban weather experience had never prepared them to comprehend. The journal pages that recorded the family's desperate search for shelter revealed how quickly mountain weather could transform from benign to lethal, creating conditions where their lightweight camping equipment proved as inadequate as paper umbrellas against the geological forces that the storm unleashed across the unstable canyon walls that surrounded their position. Owen's hands trembled as he read Alara's description of the rock slide that had initially seemed like distant thunder, until the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate with seismic intensity that made standing upright impossible. Her words capturing the terrifying realization that they were trapped in a geological event beyond human scale or control. The family's final desperate hours were documented with the methodical precision of someone who understood that their words might be the only testament to their love for each other, and their desperate attempts to survive conditions that overwhelmed every preparation they had made for their wilderness adventure. The journal entries that followed the initial rockslide painted a picture of human resilience that was both inspiring and heartbreaking, revealing how Mark and Alara had worked together to create emergency shelter for their children, while maintaining the illusion of safety even as their situation became increasingly hopeless. Alara's descriptions of Liam's attempts to remain brave for his younger brother, and Caleb's innocent questions about when they would return home, created emotional responses in Owen that his years of scientific detachment had not prepared him to handle, transforming statistical casualties back into a real family whose love had endured even in their final moments. The forensic analysis of the journal's later entries revealed handwriting that became increasingly erratic as Alara struggled with hypothermia and exhaustion, her final words barely legible, but containing expressions of love for Tom Jensen and the extended family members who would spend years wondering what had become of their missing relatives. The realization that Alara had continued writing until her physical condition made it impossible to hold a pen transformed her journal from historical document into sacred text that bore witness to human dignity, maintained against impossible circumstances. Owen's report to the authorities marked the beginning of a process that would finally provide closure to the Jensen family's surviving relatives and bring an end to more than a decade of conspiracy theories that had transformed their tragedy into public entertainment. The press conference where Sheriff Chen announced the discovery drew media attention from across the country. But the revelation that the family had been victims of geological accident rather than human predation seemed to disappoint reporters who had built careers on the more sensational theories that had dominated public speculation about the case. Tom Jensen's response to learning the truth about his brother's fate was captured in newspaper photographs that showed a man whose grief had finally been given definitive shape after 13 years of uncertainty that had prevented any normal mourning process from occurring. The family's decision to leave the remains in their mountain resting place, rather than attempting recovery operations that would endanger additional lives, reflected an understanding that some tragedies transcend human ability to impose conventional resolution on natural forces that operate beyond moral categories. The online conspiracy communities that had thrived on speculation about serial killers and government cover-ups struggled to accept revelations that reduced their elaborate theories to irrelevant fiction, with some members continuing to promote alternative explanations even after physical evidence had definitively established the truth about the family's fate. The psychological investment that thousands of people had made in mythological explanations for the Jensen disappearance proved more durable than factual evidence, revealing how human beings often prefer complex lies to simple truths that fail to satisfy their need for meaningful narratives about random tragedy. The impact of Owen's discovery on the town of Red Creek was immediate and profound, transforming the community's relationship with its most famous mystery from source of tourist revenue into sobering reminder of nature's capacity for casual violence against human aspirations and careful planning. The memorial service that the community organized for the Jensen family 13 years after their disappearance provided an opportunity for genuine mourning that had been impossible while their fate remained unknown, allowing the healing process to finally begin for relatives and community members who had been trapped in suspended animation between hope and despair. The scientific papers that Owen published about his investigation methodology helped establish new protocols for searching in geologically unstable terrain, ensuring that future missing persons cases would benefit from the hard-won knowledge that had emerged from 13 years of failed conventional approaches to the Jensen mystery. His work demonstrated how academic geological training could be applied to law enforcement challenges, creating interdisciplinary cooperation that might prevent other families from experiencing the kind of prolonged uncertainty that had characterized the Jensen case. The broader cultural impact of the Jensen case resolution extended far beyond the immediate community that had been most directly affected, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of amateur wilderness exploration and the importance of realistic assessment of natural hazards that recreational hikers often underestimate in their eagerness to escape urban constraints. The family's story became required reading in wilderness safety courses across the region, their tragedy transformed into educational tool that might prevent similar accidents from claiming other families who underestimated the geological forces that shaped mountain environments. Owen Hayes returned to his Boulder apartment to find that his obsession with solving the Jensen mystery had been replaced by a profound sense of completion that allowed him to begin the process of rebuilding personal relationships and career prospects that had been sacrificed during his decade-long investigation. The empty spaces on his walls where maps and photographs had once created shrines to unsolved mystery now seemed to offer possibilities for new interests and normal human connections that his fixation on the Jensen case had made impossible to maintain. The legend of the Rocky Mountain family killer died quietly in internet forums and true crime podcasts, replaced by the far less dramatic but infinitely more human story of parents and children who had simply encountered natural forces beyond their suburban experience to comprehend or survive. The Jensen family's final resting place in Deadfall Canyon became a monument to the beautiful indifference of wilderness that accepts human dreams and preparations with equal disregard, claiming lives without malice through processes that operate on geological timescales that reduce individual human stories to statistical footnotes in the endless manuscript of stone and weather and time. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.